Now, how many of you have heard about a bully buck? A buck that basically takes over your herd, pushes all the other bucks off. And when I hear that, it's kind of funny. I know there are bully bucks out there and they have that attitude. And they've even shown that in enclosures and studies. 1 mile enclosure up in Camp Cousino up in Shingleton, where a younger bully buck was #1 in the herd out of 20 bucks, whatever it was. And he ruled with basically a reign of terror and a lot of death and fighting and hard fighting, and he eventually died that way. And then the next buck that took his place for the next 10 years led the pack, and he led by bluffing and posturing, and there were no deaths during that entire time. So there are bullies out there. A lot of times those are the first ones to die, but on your land, you don't have to put up with it. And you don't have to shoot them, actually, if you don't want to get rid of that bully buck. When I hear bully buck, it means that the habitat conditions on your land and the way the land is hunted is not created to actually hold more mature bucks. Let me talk about 5 ways to get rid of a bully buck and to fight off that bully buck on your land and actually have him be a part of your herd, part of your small portion of your herd in the buck herd, instead of pushing everything off and being the only mature buck on your land. And I'm using this land as an example. For one, you have to have separate food sources or a long line of food, separate areas within that food source that you can attract deer to that food source from all areas of your cover and even to the adjoining neighbor's edge of cover. This is only 30 acres here, so we're not holding all these deer on this 30 acres. But we do have the food to create the movement needed for bucks, and I'll point these out. We have a food plot right here. Over on this side, we have one down in the bottom behind me, and then we have one directly behind me and up above. Now, how does that separate bully bucks? These obviously are not that far. They're 100 yards apart at most, each one of them. Every deer in this area has a separate food plot to go to, 3 choices to get into this valley before they head out to the ag fields in every direction around here. Every food plot has to be planted in the same mix. I'm going to repeat that. Most often when a bully buck is taking over a land, one of the main reasons, and I'm discussing this one first, is because there's brassicas over here, there's clover down here, and there's corn over there. Each food source is peaking at a different time of the season, so the attraction level is different for that portion of the season all season long. You might have clover that's down to the dirt by October, the end of October, so the deer aren't going to that food plot anymore. You might have brassica, they're waiting until the end of November, December to hit. You might have corn over on the hill that's king in November, not doing great in October, and it's gone in December, so they're not hitting it. For that, your deer herd keeps shifting around. Very bad practice. Every food plot on your land should have the same balance. And I even go with destination plots, harvest plots, hunting plots. There are those little hunting plots that are on the way to a big food source. So it'd be something back in the woods in each one of these just to help define movement, not much different than a water hole or a mock scrape. You want every food source to be the same and have the same combination of foods. That's why I strip out my plantings. That's why in big food plots you'll have 3 strips. You might have corn, you might have brassicas, you might have beans and peas and oats. Whatever combination it is that you can get to last for the entire hunting season and give that diversity. A lot of times if it's just corn and beans, you're lacking in September. You're lacking when the beans turn brown. They're not hitting the corn yet. You really want to hit and make sure that base of green is on every plot. If you have enough room, you plant corn, and then sometimes beans are an option as well if you have a lot of space. But bottom line, same combination, because then you separate out your doe herd. The doe herds can actually, some does hit this plot every single afternoon, some hit this bottom one, and some hit the one directly behind me at the same elevation. You can count on that. As long as you have that diversity in each food plot, as long as it's a consistent draw, then they'll keep hitting that over and over again. And you don't have does going from one food plot to the next because they're peaking in attraction and getting in fights with the other does and causing a high layer of stress, because guess what? The whole property becomes a high level of stress to any mature buck in the area. And typically, instead of 4 or 5 bucks relating to a small parcel every single afternoon coming into diverse and different and separated food sources, then you have one in the form of a big bully buck that just pushes all the other bucks and deer herd around, and he's the one that's going to die first because he's very aggressive and hard-headed. He's going to take over a small area like this because he doesn't have that separation. He probably doesn't want to do, and he's probably stressed out himself. You got to calm him down. make sure you offer the same food in all those plots so the same does and fawns can hit boringly the same food plots every single afternoon. And that's how you first begin to put in place the steps needed to not only ward off and fight off a bully buck, but to actually put more deer on your land and have more mature bucks. The second is cover. So in the case of each one of these food plots, whether it's the lower plot going right up the gut, the one over on this side, or the one on the other side, they each have a point or hollow inside of the point or bowl where does and fawns can bed every single day. And so you have the food down here, we have screening on the outside of the edge of the food, you can see the switchgrass around here. And so for that, we not only set the table for the does and the feeding, but we do it in 3 locations based on this food source. And we could even say on this back food source behind us, because it's long on that hill and it stretches around the corner, there's 2 separate feeding areas. So we actually literally get does that enter at one end of the field or the other, and they're separated. They do not want to come into the big field, and it goes back to even those dispersing yearling bucks. They're kicked out of the herd from female social pressure. The last thing they want to do is to come on a land dominated by female social pressure and big single food plots. They just get kicked off and move on. Yearling bucks disperse an average of 1 mile to 1.5 miles, and you want to set the table for them. If you don't have those separated does hitting separate food sources that contain the same level of diversity that they can feed on all season long, then you're going to run does into each other, you're going to run bedding areas into each other. If you have to have the separate food, the separate bedding areas go along with it. And what that does is it creates small lines of deer movement. Does to the screening, down to the food. That's a line of deer movement just involving does that go hit that every single day. It's a full line, and you can actually maintain that all season long if you have those separate feedings, if you have cover for each, and the cover just has to be adequate. The perfect buck bed, the perfect deer bed, I often find is not the perfect deer bed as shown online in some places. You need side cover, you need hardwood regeneration, some acorns thrown in is okay, some chestnuts, but no apples, because if you have apples and fruit back in the bedding areas, why do they need to go down and hit the food plots every day before dark? They don't. They can stand up, get some good scrumptious moisture-laden food, high quality food. They don't need to leave that area before dark. So you really want hardwood browse, hard mass back in the hills. You want that hard to digest. And what's the first thing they do? They come down and hit that food source. So if each one of those doe family groups, several doe family groups that actually can complement each other, have their space for bedding that can relate to individual food sources, then you can begin to separate and calm your deer herd down and ward off the effects, fight off the effects of a bully buck. The next thing, if you have sweeteners, the fourth way, you don't want to have a water hole right in the middle of it all, because now you're bringing all the deer to a water hole potentially before they hit the food sources at night. You're concentrating deer. So we have a water hole here, we have a water hole up on top over here, we have a water hole on top over here, and then we have one lower. We actually have 2 low separated by points. They're about 350 yards apart, straight as a crow flies, which is probably 500 feet of length going down the hill and back up of surface area. And then we have 2 up top that are almost a 1/4 mile apart. And so we have separate water holes based on the bedding needs of each individual line of movement. And we also have mock scrapes that complement every stand location that takes advantage of every movement as well. So we have stands over here. We have stands up top, we have 6 or 7 along the top, and then we have them down here too. So every movement we can take advantage of, whether it's high or low, as those deer are coming down into this bowl. Bucks relate to each individual line of movement. So when you create those lines of movement, we have separate food, separate bedding, and then buck bedding above. You're not going to get those bucks to bed no matter what kind of bed you make in between food and those does. Those does want to pack in as tight to those food sources as possible. You want to create those daylight bedding areas for those does, because that allows those does to pack in as close as they can. And then if you're packing does within 50 yards to 75 yards of those food sources, then you have room left over for bucks, even on a 30-acre cover parcel like this where they're bedding back in the woods, even if it's partly on the neighbors up there. So now you have not only doe bedding, not only food sources, but you have buck bedding as well. And that's a complete line of movement, especially when you add the water holes and mock scrapes, those sweeteners, to the entire movement. So we've talked about food, we've talked about having that separated cover, we've talked about those sweeteners, and we've talked about having those individual those movements of does into each spot. And number 5, one of the best ways, you have this all set up, it all goes to pot if you actually destroy the attraction of the food plots by hunting over them too much, applying too much hunting pressure, and ruining the doe movement and the doe opportunity for bedding right next to the food plots. That blows everything right out the water. So if you allow this to happen every day, does it make more sense? It's more important not to spook out these does that are hitting these food sources every day, and the consistency and allowing that to happen all season long. If you spook a buck bedding up top by accident, not a big deal, because if these does are freely hitting that food source every day in a very low stress atmosphere, that low stress atmosphere and condition is going to attract those mature bucks back. And guess what? When you have 3 or 4 movements on a property like this, the food plots represent the bottom of the funnel of daylight movement. You have multiple bucks using multiple lines of movement. And what happens is a lot of times we'll see is the end of October, we shoot one out, and guess what? Another buck slots in its place, because we have this condition of low stress, low hunting pressure area down here with separate food sources that contain the same diversity, and another buck slots in, because there's hardly, if you manage your property this way, you'll be the top 5% in the area, likely 1% in certain areas, because hardly anybody manages this way. Even if they happen to get lucky and put the pieces together in place, they blow it out by applying too much hunting pressure. I have a redneck blind right here behind the camera, behind Dylan. It's about 30 yards from where I'm sitting. The edge of this food plot, the closest shot is 150 yards. This food plot down here is over 100 yards, and you can't even hardly see the food plot. We had to cut an extensive amount of goldenrod to even see it. We're actually gonna lift that up on a 5-foot redneck lift for this year platform. But I shot my buck out here at 175 yards with a muzzleloader. I shot 2 does out here over 225 yards. Diane shot her split brow buck, the giant buck that we're showing footage of right now. She shot that from that redneck at 235 yards with her 243 over on the other food plot over there. They come to this, that was the 7th day of gun season. Dante shot his buck over here the 9th day of gun season, just on the other side of that food plot. I shot mine about the 4th or 5th day of muzzleloader, which takes place in December. So these deer come into this. Again, if you shoot one, they slot in, fill that space. You can't blow it out. If you do all this, now that bully buck that you have, he just slots in over here. He doesn't want to be that aggressive. He doesn't want to be that stressed out. He doesn't want to fight. It's kind of like a dog. Have you ever seen dogs that are aggressive? If you just leave them alone, and you don't put them in a big open kennel with a bunch of other dogs, guess what? If they're left off to the side, they have their food, they have their comfort, they have their own safe space where they don't see a lot of other deer, and they can't interact with a bunch of other aggressive dogs, then you calm them down. It's when you throw other dogs into that mix that you add gas on the fire of that aggressive dog. So fight off the effects of that bully buck, calm them down, calm the entire deer herd down. But it all starts with those separate food sources, diverse food sources, creating separate lines of movement to those food sources, make sure everything's the same on the property. Let the deer settle in a line based on dominance. They'll figure it out themselves. You have the subordinate deer taking over the lesser areas. You have the dominant does take over the better areas. You have the bucks that relate to those. Let them figure it out where they want to bed up there. You just have to give them that space and that line. When you separate your deer herd, when you create those micro movements separate around your parcel, then you can fight off the effects of a buck. And not only can you fight him off, I believe you can calm him down. You can put him in his place, in his slot, and when he grows old enough to kill, you can shoot him, and you're going to be able to do so, because hunting over micro movements that are very defined all season long, and you let them take place, is almost easy to do, because your conditions you set up, your neighboring pressure, even on the next 40, if they push the line, they just push deer closer to you. They don't like to get out of those lines of movement that are safe for them every day. And that's how you create the conditions to fight off a bully buck. I hope it makes sense, but it's not just fighting off a bully buck. It's making your hunt a lot easier. It's attracting more deer to your land. It's putting more mature bucks focused daylight on one parcel. Don't believe the bad buck science out there that says bucks have a whole mile 3 miles. Yeah, they can, but not when things get slotted in like this. They'll hold a lot tighter for a higher percentage of time on your land, and that's the best science. It's based on experience. And you can apply those tactics to your land and not only have a great herd this hunting season, but a great hunt for that herd. And you can fight off the effects of the bully bucks that might be on your land this season.